This is a 102.7 FM Toowoomba original podcast.
Welcome everybody to my podcast, Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan and I love to talk, but I also love to listen. If you're new here, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the episode. And we have Stewart Koster joining us today. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Megan. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, Ian, you were recommended to me as a interesting person that one John Osborne, OAM, who's a well-known figure here in Toowoomba, had a lot to do with you because you have just completed a huge mural on the corner of Margaret and Clifford, isn't it? Yes. So
yeah.
Why was John red hot for you to do this mural? What's it all about?
John gets keen about lots of things, and I thoroughly admire his enthusiasm to tackle a project with 100% effort and not stop until it's finished. I mean, that's John, isn't it? He's an amazing bloke, and I first bumped into him, if that's the word for it, in the late 1990s when I was on the board of directors at Chunderi and Woolshed. And he was invited to participate in a workshop, a forum, a discussion thingamy. He was marketing manager, I think, for McCafferty's at the time, and he'd been on the Toowoomba Regional Council, Toowoomba City Council, and his opinion was valued. And some years later, he became manager at Chunderi and Woolshed, and so I've sort of worked with John on and off for quite a while. But I don't know that he knew that I had the interest in Cobb and Co that I did, and anyway, I mean, that's a different story altogether, but if you'd like a quick anecdote, when I was in high school in Brisbane, I wasn't like most blokes trying to go out with girls. It was a great thing for me to hop on the bus and go into the city and go to the Oxley Library and pore through their filing cabinets of old Cobb and Co pictures. I looked up Cobb and Co, and in those days, the photos weren't 100 years old. You were allowed to touch them with your hands, and I'd just flip through them, and I had my camera with me, and I had a darkroom at home, and I'd re-photograph some of the pictures because, there were these great photos from Western Queensland with coaches in them. I was just sort of fascinated. And in the Brisbane Post Office Museum in Queen Street, there was this 1/3 scale coach that Cole Ferguson had built around about 1970. I decided that I wanted to build myself a Cobb and Co coach, so if I wasn't going through the bits and pieces at the Oxley Library, I went to the Post Office Museum and I started to measure up the coach in there to draw myself up a set of plans. And so I was keen way back then on Cobb and Co and the history of it.
The boy from BBC was catching the Toowong whatever into town and not going and hanging out in the Queen Street Mall with Rock and Roll George, but you were going to the John Oxley Library.
Yes.
Where did the fascination with coaches come from and Cobb and Co? Had you heard the story when you were younger, or?
No, I was born in South Africa, but I've just got these mental images in my mind of the Zulus going past with bullocks, or we call them oxen over there, with bullock wagons going past the farm, carrying wattle bark to a nearby tannery. And, it's just this image of goodness knows what, but it's one of these little images that stays. And when I was 5 or 6, my mother won a photography competition with this photo she took on the farm of an old wagon wheel leaning up against I don't know, it could have been a gum tree, it could have been anything over there, but the tree had actually grown up over the tyre and kept on going, and there was this bantam rooster sitting on the tyre, and she took it was a colour slide in those days of that, and she won a regional photo competition. And I guess I've just got this, wagon wheel and wagon teams and things just sitting in the back of my mind. It got shelved for a while, but in the mid-1970s over here in Australia, my dad bought a part share in a gold mine near Pratton, which is northwest of Warwick. In amongst the bundle of metalwork beside the old miner's shack was some springs and axles and things, and somebody said, "Oh, that used to be a sulky," and my dad kind of dared me to try and restore it. I took all the bits home, and over time just learnt that it wasn't a sulky, it wasn't anything, it was just about a quarter of a buggy, a quarter of a wagonette, maybe a fifth of a sulky, bits of a wagon. It was just lots of spare parts, but the process involved in trying to research what these little pieces of metal actually were, I guess, planted a seed, and it's still growing.
And that wouldn't have been easy, I wouldn't imagine. You're not looking up on the internet to see what this piece is, and you were in the library or in the encyclopedias, I would imagine?
No, I tried to get hold of whatever book I could and went to the State Library in the city and looked up whatever old books they had, which wasn't much, started going through old newspapers and trying to meet people. The trouble is when you don't have experience in that field, you can't really get experience in that field. Horses weren't as popular then or as in the public eye then as they are now, but I started to put the sulky together anyway and found enough other bits and pieces and slowly made progress. And then somebody said to me, they're doing wheel riding out at John Derry and Woolshed. So I saved up some money and hopped on a bus. It was Aladdin's Tours in those days. The fellow who ran it, I don't know his name, but he lived just up the road from us in Upper Brookfield. And I took an excursion out to the Woolshed to the Heritage Festival, and there was a sign there saying volunteer help needed with the restoration. So I approached Kelly Lostro with some trepidation and said who I was. I was only sort of 15 and a half at the time. And he took me under his wing, and for the next 2 and a bit years, every school holidays, I'd bus up to John Derry and Woolshed and camp in the shearers' quarters, and he sort of taught me wheelwrighting, blacksmithing, everything, that he knew, but I had to do it the hard way. There was no using a router to round over timber. You had to do it with a spoke shave and a draw knife and a rasp, and when you'd finished, there had to be absolutely no traces of any tool marks left on any woodwork. Kelly set a high standard, but he became like a father or a grandfather to me. It was a friendship that lasted for about 8 or 9 years until he passed away.
What an incredible story. And you said you camped out in the woolshed, and were your parents worried about you, or were they curious about what you got up to? Or?
I don't know whether they looked at me in despair. Both my grandfathers were engineers, and it had always been drummed into me that you're going to be an engineer because you're good at maths, you're good at physics, chemistry. So that was kind of the path that I was steered into. But I still had this inkling that I liked the woolshed, and somebody said to me, "Oh, look, you'll never make a career out of fixing horse-drawn vehicles or painting horse-drawn vehicles." But sometimes there's reverse psychology in that kind of negativity. Ticking someone off like that was a lot more common than it is these days. In this kind of woke culture, you're not allowed to say anything negative to anybody, it seems. But back then, a bit of negativity would often prompt you to try harder to prove the person wrong. You kind of did what you were told a bit more back then, but I still started to enjoy the woolshed. Reg Bartz was a tremendous ambassador for the place. He was a people person, and you couldn't help but like the fellow. And the woolshed itself as a building became the centre of where everybody gathered for the Heritage Festival, which was just a wonderful feeling to be a part of.
Yeah.
It grew and grew.
Yes, that's right. And I want to talk some more about your upbringing and things, but we digress. I want to know all about this project. So why did John Osborne have a bee in his bonnet about having a big 50-foot by 16-foot mural painted on the side of the building?
Generically, it was because last year, 2024, was the centenary of the last Cobb and Co coach run that ran as a commercial run, and it was between Yuleba and Surat on the 14th of August 1924. And so last year was the centenary year, and the community out at Yuleba, or between Yuleba and Surat, started running horse-drawn vehicle treks over the last 15 years prior to the centenary. Every 5 years they would muster up community support, and a bunch of people from southeast Queensland mostly would take horse-drawn vehicles out and retrace the steps of the last coach run. And we went out in 2019 and took a 5-horse team of Clydesdales and our drover's wagonette out.
What was the name of the wagonette?
Pearl.
Lady Pearl, right. I wondered what Lady Pearl was. I wondered whether it was a dog or one of the names of the horses, or the person who drove the.
No, Doug Bunker, who left her to us after he passed away, named her after a grandmother of his. He built a few horse-drawn vehicles, and this wagonette was the first, and he named her Lady Pearl. He then built a double-decker horse bus, which he called Lady Grace, after his other grandmother. So that's where Pearl came from.
You had been participating in these anniversary of the last run of the Cobb and Co, yeah. When you decided that you would take this job on and you were going to paint it, what was your sort of thinking around crafting and what you wanted to paint up there to commemorate such an important event in Australian history?
That's a great question. Having travelled the path itself that the coach took, it just gives you a sense of ownership, perhaps, of the project, more so than anybody who just stood back and looked at it on a map or read about it on the internet. You've got to appreciate the difficulties, the I won't say harshness, but the fact that no matter what the weather was, they had a job to do. The mail had to get through back in those days. And there was none of this, if it's flood it, forget it kind of thing.
All that woke rubbish.
Having been out there and covered the trail, and not only covered the trail itself ourselves, but I also retraced Doug Bunker's steps when he took Lady Pearl down over that same route back in 1978. It's creating a bit of our own history. And to me, a lot of people say, oh, the Clydesdales are archaic, and so are horse-drawn vehicles, why do you do it? It's retracing old steps, but it's also creating your own little bit of history for yourself and for your family to look back upon. You've got to enjoy it or you wouldn't be doing it, and you've got to smile while you're doing it, even though some things get tough. But having been out there and done that, and also been terribly keen on accurate history must tell the truth, I eventually managed to find an old photograph of the last coach. And there'd been much debate over the years as to which coach was the last coach. The number 112, which is in the Cobb and Co Museum, you go back 20 plus years ago, everybody used to say that was the last coach. But in fact, it wasn't. And
it was actually 141, was it not?
Correct. Number 112 lived at, and so did number 141. And the difference was 112 was a 14-passenger coach and 141 was an 8-passenger coach. And depending on the mail load, they would either use the big one or the small one. So each coach actually had their own last run, but the actual real last run was a non-passenger run, apparently just parcels. And the little coach was used because that was all that was needed. But it had apparently rained the night before, and the going was expected to be extra hard, so they put an 8-horse team in the coach, which was not typical for Cobb and Co, but it was done when it was needed, 4 in the lead and 4 on the pole. So, the knowledge about that compared with most people who would just go to Google and find a picture of a team of 4 or a team of 5 pulling a thing that masquerades as a coach, which is what a lot would do, to me isn't quite right, but I had to do it properly. So I found this picture of the actual coach, but it was in terrible condition. It had been reproduced from microfilm, but it was pretty ordinary. And after much more research, I found a better quality version of the same picture in the Australasian coach and motor body builder. And so I set about blowing that up, but it was only a tiny little picture, not much bigger than a playing card, and the detail in it wasn't good enough to use. If you enlarge that to be 50 feet wide, it would look terrible. I then set about recreating each of the horses in some degree of reality, and the coach itself was just blur. So I found a picture of a decent one, which is almost the same, and tweaked the perspectives and things like that so that it matched exactly what was in the picture, and then set about recreating the picture myself on the computer, and then set about colour tinting it using Photoshop to colorise it. Because what I was planning on doing wasn't meant to be a photograph in itself, it was meant to be somewhat arty, I decided to make the 2 horses closest to the viewer sepia and make the coach sepia, kind of like an old sepia photograph. Many people have sepia pictures of their grandparents or great-grandparents. And then I wanted to have the other horses kind of fading off into a watercolour arty effect in the background. So it had, reality, and it had detail as well as having a bit of an arty effect too, rather than just being, uniform in its style.
Well, it's certainly beautiful, Ian. If you go and have a look at it and stand across the street and look at it, it is beautiful. My sort of impression was it's like a purpley blue colour, the horses. Was that intentional?
I'm a great one for sleeping on things. And I don't know, 20-odd years ago, I came across a book called A Whack in the Seat of the Pants and A Kick in the Side of the Head. There was a series of 2 books, and I forget who wrote them, but they were on creative thinking. And one of the big messages that came out of both books was that people get comfortable living in their rut and spending life in their rut. And once you get into a rut, you can't really see out over the top of it because all you can see is the narrow tunnel ahead of you. And in order to improve your ability to think creatively, one of the things you need to do is stop habits that you have been accustomed to and start doing things differently. In other words, if you're right-handed and you brush your teeth with your right hand, put your toothbrush in your left hand and do it that way. If you normally comb your hair or brush your hair with your right hand, use your left hand. Swap your knife and fork over at the table. It'll look funny, but practice doing that. Change hands when you need to have a cup of tea or something like that. And slowly get used to doing things differently, and your mind will then subconsciously start to realise that there are alternative approaches to problems, and subconsciously you just get perhaps a better ability, I guess. I don't know. It just opens up your mind to coming up with alternative answers. And this is digressing away a little bit, but going back to the photograph of the horses, the second horse from the near side in the lead was a grey horse. And we've found a couple of other photographs which also prove that on that last coach run they had a grey horse there. So rather than making it a blacky grey, I decided to make it a bluey grey, just because that's an alternative to a sepia browny grey or any other colour. So after making it sort of a bluey grey colour, we needed some lights and darks, and that's where the purples came from, because purple is, a variation of blue. It gives the picture a little bit more life. It gives people something to look at and say, oh, I wonder why you did that.
Well, I love your attention to detail. I'll just remind the listeners that we're on Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan, and we're speaking with Ian Stewart Koster, another hyphenated double name, excellent, man after my own heart, who's the owner and partner at Traditional Signs. Now, why did John choose you as an artist? You may have been someone who had an interest in coaches and things, but how did he know that you were an artist?
When he was manager at John Deere and Woolshed, I was a volunteer there, and I'm a sign writer, and amongst other things, he got talking. We needed some signs, and I offered to do them. So he had an idea that I could do effective signage. The whole idea about sign writing is communication. I make sure that any sign communicates its message properly rather than being overpowered by background or other things. And so he knew I was a sign writer, and a year before he'd spoken to me saying, he would like a brass plaque made. He said, I know anybody who could do it. And I said, well, yeah, I can. And he said that I forget the name of the lane now, Chalk Lane rings a bell, but it's just up from Margaret Street, Ruthven Street intersection in Toowoomba. There's a little lane there on the eastern side of the crossroads, and the building right on the corner had been a ticket office for Cobb and Co in the mid to late 1800s in Toowoomba. And John wanted that building to have an acknowledgement of the fact that this had been a Cobb and Co ticket office, and he wanted it to be planted there and unveiled at the start of the centenary year of the last Cobb and Co coach run. So I designed and made this brass plaque, which we installed and unveiled on 13th or 14th thereabouts of August 2024, and that was kind of like the start of the centenary year celebrations for Cobb and Co.
Yeah, what an amazing story. So where did your artistic abilities come from? You mentioned that you'd come from Africa. Had you always been someone who did art? Or
I enjoyed art, but I did all of the maths, calculus, and vectors, computer work and things like that at school. I didn't do much art at school, although I kind of enjoyed it, but I never really liked your abstracty type stuff. I always enjoyed photographically accurate, detailed stuff. People say you're talented. I don't think so. It's a function of hard work and determination more than anything else. When I was trying to finish up this first sulky that I'd restored, I went to the Queensland Museum quite a bit, and there were a lot of horse-drawn vehicles there which had been restored and painted and striped by a fellow called Alec Hamilton. And Alec had been a coach painter. He was born in 1898, and when he was 14 he started working for his father's business, which was Hamilton's Coach and Motor Body Builders in Chermside. And he'd been a coach painter all his life. And I'd studied his work and I'd tried to paint his scrolls, and they were incredibly difficult, and I didn't really know how to do it. But the fellow just up the road from us in Brookfield used to have a bicycle shop in Paddington in Sydney. He got multiple sclerosis and lost the feeling in his fingers. And when I was in about grade 12 at school, he gave me this box of scrolling brushes that he was no longer able to use. And that was a tremendous treat. His name was Ken Liddell. And anyway, I started using these brushes and found that I could paint stripes and scrolls a little more easily than I could with my crappy little old Chinese hog's hair school art brushes. But, I was never game to actually talk to Alec Hamilton other than just admiring his work. You could tell that he knew what he was doing, and you could tell that other people who'd striped horse-drawn vehicles didn't, because they'd just put lines all over the place. And anyway, in 1986, I finally got up the courage to phone him up when I was down in Brisbane for a couple of days. And he said to me, I've been waiting for a phone call from you. And I thought, goodness me, how come? And he said, well, I was at the Brisbane Echo a couple of months ago, and I saw this bulky that I would have sworn I must have striped, but I knew I hadn't. And I asked them who'd done it, and they told me that you had. And he said, I've been wanting to meet you ever since.
Oh,
And at
wow.
that stage, Alex was in his mid-80s, so I thought I couldn't have asked for a better introduction. So I skedaddled over to Chermside and introduced myself to him. He took me downstairs and stirred up some paint and got his brush out, and he painted one of his scrolls on a board in front of me, and he said, "Here, now you do it." And, I'd spent years anguishing over how in the heck you paint these jolly things, and watching him do it in 3 or 4 strokes, just boom, 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 finished. It was just like a light going off in my head. And, it was suddenly so easy because I knew the map of where everything had to go. I just was unfamiliar with the brush strokes, and seeing him do it, I copied it perfectly. And he got his daughter to come down, Joan, and, she couldn't tell the difference, and he couldn't and I couldn't. And, that was just wonderful. And
So
he said to me...
Sorry to interrupt you, but for those of us who don't know, what does scrolling and striping mean?
It's painting lines. Striping is painting lines. People call it pinstriping these days, but to him, pinstripes were the lines on suits, and he just called it lining and striping. It's where you're painting lines around the hubs, lines along the spokes and on chamfers and things like that. It's an artistic way of lightening the appearance of a vehicle, making it look a little bit more stylish. Kind of like, these days people tend to put plastic striping tape on the side of cars, or they did 20-odd years ago. And scrolling is what you still see a lot of on semi-trailers and things these days, scrolls. But a lot of the modern ones are kind of like repetitive spirals. They don't really resemble the old acanthus leaf, which is a plant, which is an organic shape, I suppose, of painting the scrolls. If you go back to your Greek Corinthian columns and things like that, they're all leafy and flowery, and a lot of the horse-drawn vehicle scroll work in the old days basically was stylised versions of that.
And you love striping so much that you set your own record. What was that about, Ian?
Oh, I'm part of a group of signwriters who call themselves letterheads, in the sense that car enthusiasts call themselves petrol heads and signwriters call themselves letterheads. And we meet annually in different states each year in Australia and also overseas. Some years ago, they decided to start up a pinstriping racetrack, and everyone who attended would get out their brushes and try to zip a couple of lines around this racetrack, 2 people against each other, to see who could go from the start to the finish the fastest. And
so are you painting it on paper?
Yeah.
Or?
No, you're painting it on an aluminium board, so it's fairly smooth.
Right.
And it's about 6 by 4 foot, roughly. And it's painted up to look like an old Scalextric's motor car racing track. And everybody had to stripe an outside lane and an inside lane with their brush. So you're dipping your brush in the paint, and then off you go. You can have as many dips as you like, but you're painting a stripe that's about 1.5 millimetres wide, maybe 2 millimetres wide, and as long and as straight as you can possibly make it to get right round this track twice while you're dodging the other person, because you have to overlap. You head in opposite directions at the same time. It's fun rather than serious, but it takes a bit of skill to do any good. And I ended up winning the race then, and 4 or 5 times over the next few years. But one evening they decided to have a bit of a competition to see who could paint the longest stripe with one dip of the brush in the paint. And this was at a meet at Teesdale, which is in Victoria. And it was about midnight, and it was freezing cold, like 6 or 7 degrees, and it was as foggy as anything. You could see your breath in front of you. And I think because of the low temperature and the humidity, the paint didn't go off so quickly. And it took me 15, nearly 20 minutes, but I painted a stripe 134 feet long, just going round and round and round, slowly spiralling inside each previous circuit of this course until I finally couldn't squeeze another millimetre out of the brush. But it was one continuous line, 134 feet.
Which is about 41 metres, is that right?
That's probably about right, yes. And, no one's ever come close, and I haven't even been able to get that close, because generally the paint sort of starts... You're using enamel paint, and it starts to get sticky fairly quickly.
Well,
and
they
it just
sound
doesn't
like
want to flow.
wild old shows. These. What was that? Was that a sign writing conference?
It was a letterhead.
Letterheads. That's right. Well, we've gone off a little bit from our intended. Yes, but it's all very interesting, because I know that you like setting records, and I'm going to ask you about another record that you broke on the weekend down at Barellan. But just getting back to the Cobb and Co story. So,
yes.
What was the role of Bill Bolton here in Toowoomba, and his? Could you tell the listeners what his involvement with Cobb and Co coaches were?
Bill Bolton, I never met him. I only met his son David, who I believe passed away on Monday morning, just gone, very sadly. But Bill himself was an accountant, and he bought the rights to the Cobb and Co name and started up a bus company and developed that into a bigger a coach company and started travelling from Toowoomba to Brisbane and Toowoomba out west, and basically continuing the Cobb and Co coach name, but using motor coaches. And he became fascinated by horse-drawn vehicle history, and there's a famous stamp produced in 1954, I think it was, which was the centenary of when Cobb and Co started in Australia, 1854. Now, I don't know if it was a painting or an etching. It might have been an etching, but he made this famous etching of a coach, which was turned into a stamp, and it was released in 1954. Anyway, Bill Bolton bought the original of that from Lionel Lindsay, and that sort of started a friendship between him and Lionel Lindsay, which lasted, I think, until one or the other passed away. But that's, I think, how the Lionel Lindsay collection came to be in Toowoomba. Bill Bolton bought a lot of his work, and he also set about buying Cobb and Co coaches and other horse-drawn vehicles just for his own interest. I guess his business was doing well, and he decided that he wanted to preserve this aspect of Australian history, and we need to all be thoroughly grateful that he had the foresight at the time when, back then people would be saying, oh, what do you want that for? That's archaic, that's old, that's blah, blah, blah. But, what Bill Bolton did for us, for Australian history, for everybody, as well as Toowoomba, was just fantastic.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So the whole Cobb and Co story was started in the 1850s, and it was originally for passengers, wasn't it? Parcels, monies for banks, and shipments of gold. So you mentioned before about that normally. How many horses would there normally be? There would normally be 4 to 6, is that right? But this occasion they had the one that you have painted, they had the bigger coach, and that's why they had the 8?
Yes, the typical horse team in Australia was a team of 5. That's what Cobb and Co is best known for, 2 horses on the pole and 3 in the lead. In America, they tended to hook all of their horses up in pairs, and they would have teams of 6 or 8 as 2, 4, 6, 8, 2 in the lead, and your leaders would be miles ahead of the others. Whereas in Australia, it's just far easier to have your horses closer to the vehicle for a lot of different reasons.
What sort of reasons would they be? Why is it different in the States to here, do you think?
Well, in the scrub, you can turn them around more quickly. You don't need as big a space to do a gigantic U-turn. As a team that's sort of stretched out 50 metres long, if something goes wrong, they're right underneath you. But also, when you have a team of, say, 8 horses where you've got 2 in the lead, 2 behind that and 2 on the pole, you've got 8 reins. Each span of 2 has a set of reins going back to the driver, so the driver's carrying 8 sets of reins in their hands, whereas when you've got 8, like in this last coach run, 4 abreast on the pole and 4 in the lead, the driver's only holding 4 reins. Each set of reins goes forward and splits into 4, so that when you pull on the near side lead rein, the 4 sections that go into, or the 4 couplings that goes into, pulls onto the near side of each horse's mouth, or the near side is the left, so that when you pull on that rein, they all turn to the left at the same time. When you pull on the other rein, they all turn to the right at the same time. And the driver's basically holding one set of reins for the leaders and one set of reins for the polers. And, it's just easier. You've only got 5 fingers in your hand and 4 gaps between them. So you're not trying to think, which rein goes where. After a while, it just becomes automatic, like driving a car and changing gears. You can just do it without thinking. You know where your reins are, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had not. When you say something's on the pole, what does that mean?
A lot of people call the horses on the pole the wheelers because they're closest to the wheels of the coach. But the pole is a piece of wood that comes out from the undercarriage and pokes forwards. With a pair of horses, you have one on each side, and that's how they steer the coach. As they go forwards, they can push the pole around left or right a little bit based on the fact that they're tied to it at the front where their collars are, but also the way they're set up with their swingle bars at the back and connected to the axle. It's just on the pole was just old terminology.
Yeah, right. If you've just tuned in, we're on Big Little Small Talk. We're talking with Ian Stewart Koster, who is an artist. He's a sign writer. He's a striper and lots of other things to boot. Now, could I ask you about the horses? Are they specific sort of horses? They're not Clydesdales, are they?
The Cobb and Co horses? No. A lot of people would say they're whalers, which was a term for generic station crossbred horses, I believe, going back to the early 1900s. A lot of the time, apparently, Cobb and Co would take farmers' horses to train them. They'd be travelling past somebody's place. There'd be a changing station there. Farmers who needed their horses broken in would say, here, take this. And Cobb and Co would get the free use of the horse for a while the farmer got their horse educated. It was a function of whatever was available at the time. They didn't want draft horses as such or heavy horses because they needed to be able to get from A to B quickly. And the coach wasn't something that weighed 7 or 8 tonnes. It wasn't a bull wagon or a wheat wagon carrying the farmer's annual produce to the railhead. It was something that needed to get the mail through fairly quickly and hopefully from A to B before sunset. So they needed horses that could canter along or trot along at a fair speed without getting knocked up. And your real heavy horses weren't made for that, but a lot of farm horses might have had a bit of heavy blood in them and a bit of light blood, and you could call them light draft if you wanted, or heavy station hacks. Sometimes it was just whatever they could get.
And they talk about Cobb and Co being the lifeline to the bush, and sometimes the passengers, if they were going up steep hills, not only were they expected to get out, but they were expected to push the coach as well.
Read that too.
Yeah.
And you don't blame them if you sort of have a bit of sympathy for the horses.
Yes, that's right. Tell me about, do you know anything about prickly pear jam and stewed galah that you could get at some of the stops along the way?
I don't. I'm happy for you to tell me.
No, I don't know. I just read that, but I thought prickly pear jam and stewed galah, like that, you just don't get more Aussie than that, do you?
No. The only prickly pear type story I've heard was there was a group of non-Australians who were on this coach going from A to B, and it was pretty muddy going, and they wouldn't get out to help. And the driver finally pulled the coach up to a stop, couldn't go any further, suggested they hop out, and there were a number of prickly pears around, and suggested that they hang their coats on these prickly pear bushes for whatever reason, I don't know. But when they then went to retrieve their coats, they were full of prickles and they couldn't put them on, and that somehow prompted them into, while they were on the ground, push the coach out of the bog they were in and move on.
Oh, wow. And we haven't even touched on the whole bushranger sort of thing. But just before we leave talking about the beautiful painting of yours,
Yes.
John said to me that he wanted to get you to do it because you had the ability to paint horses to ensure the legs are in correct proportion to the body, and very few artists can do that. Are you aware that that's one of your special skills?
No, I wasn't, but I know where he's coming at because I'm also a horse judge, and one of the things I'm emphatic about is quality of legs. And I think I can judge better than I can paint legs, but they have to look right and they have to be right. But there was an old saying, no foot, no horse. In other words, the quality of the horse comes from the quality of the foot. And so, I figured, these legs had to be right. And when I was painting the mural, it was easy to get lost because you've got 8 horses, that's 32 legs, and they're trotting along so that the legs are forwards and backwards. And if you just drew a rectangular crop through the middle of the leg section, you've just got blobs and blobs and more blobs and more blobs, and some were background and some were splashes and some were legs of this horse, that horse. They're all over the place. And a couple of times I just had to sit back and think, well, what in the heck's this little shape that I'm painting here now?
Yeah. And also, I believe that you painted it offside on panels. Is that right, Ian?
Yes. It's there are 2 ways of doing a mural. You can do it in situ or do it on something else and install it later. And I figured for the size of this and for longevity and for the detail I wanted to put into it, I needed to paint it on panels at home. So it's on 21 separate aluminium composite sheeting panels. So I set up a little frame in the shed and I could hold 3 at a time on it. So I had to break the whole design down into 21 little pieces and then set about drawing each one out on each panel and painting it and then moving it along and then doing the next one and then the next one, and then you take the first one off and slide the next panel along and keep going. And to keep a recipe or a map of what colours were where, the sky on the top of this panel and on the top of the next panel has to match the sky on the bottom of the panels above it, and the mud on the ground sections has to match the mud colour on the panels below it. So it was a case of really keeping a clear head and working out what colours were where. But I also painted it in automotive urethane base coat, and I did that on purpose because knowing where John wanted it to go there in Clifford Street, it faces west, so you've got the setting sun on it every day of the year. And ordinary house paints and aerosol paints that a lot of mural people will use just aren't going to hang around and still be looking pristine in 10 or 15 years' time. whereas a lot of your automotive paints these days are just high-quality pigments. So I did it all in base coat and then put 2 coats of a 2-pack anti-graffiti clear coat over the top for protection.
Yeah, right. Just incredible. Have you ever done anything of this scale, Ian?
Not of this scale. I've done smaller murals, and not that I sort of go out of my way to look for them, but when work sort of lands on your lap and something like this is wanted, you do it. I did one for the Oki show, for their centenary show. I think it was the centenary. That mural was 6 by 3 metres, and it featured a Hereford cow and a horse jumping over a jump, and a Clydesdale in the foreground ploughing, and windmill in the background, and other bits and pieces. And down at the village of Yuleba in New South Wales, we had a letterheads function there where signwriters from all over the place converged on the town and spent time repainting a lot of old advertising signs, throughout the town just for the fun of it. There was a fellow called Wilf Norris who was a local farmer. He'd had Clydesdales all his life, or draft horses all his life, and he was a lovely fellow. They decided that they wanted a picture of him on the wall of the museum. He had this little photograph, and the horses in the photo were only about the size of a postage stamp, and his reaper and binder was similarly sized. And a couple of other fellows started to do it, and Wilf was there in the background saying, "No, you've got the reins wrong. No, that horse isn't right. No, your harness is wrong." And I was overdoing some gold leaf work on another building. And after a while, these 3 fellows walked over to me and said, "Look, Ian, can you come over here and finish this and get Wilf off our back?" So I went over and I could see, they didn't really know what they were doing because you couldn't see much detail in the picture, and parts of the reaper and binder looked like trees and parts of the trees looked like bits of machinery. And so I just sort of turned around and fixed the horses up as well as I could. And, I still don't consider myself to be an artist. It's more the ability to produce something and then copy or replicate what you've produced. I'm not that good at coming up with something from scratch without spending a lot of time thinking about it. But anyway, with Wilk's horses, I could see what they'd done and I could see what they'd done wrong, and it was just a matter of painting out the wrong bits with more background and then putting the harness on. And I've made my own harness for years, so I knew what wingers look like and what backbands and trace chains and collars look like, so I was able to paint all of those, and Wilf was just so thrilled. And I've driven a reaper and binder and with Clydesdales and cut a crop of oats. So, I know the mechanisms and whatnot in a reaper and binder too, so I was able to get all of that back to what it should have been on the wall of the museum, and everyone was happy.
It's one thing to be able to use one. It's another thing to be able to paint it. It's just an incredible skill. So you mentioned the Clydesdales there. You love Clydesdales, don't you? Now tell me about being down in Barellan. Barellan was what? It was, you set a Guinness World Record, the largest team of horses laden on a wagon. It was a 62-horse team, is that correct?
That's correct. I didn't have anything to do with it as such. My wife and I take a market stall that she has called Aussie Heavy Horses, and we've been going down there for 10 years, and I take my paintbrushes down and usually do a bit of sign writing on some water carts or something like that, basically just reenacting heritage trades to become a bit of an attraction. But the town of Barellan is about halfway between Sydney and Adelaide, and it's famous for Yvonne Goolagong, Yvonne Corley. She grew up there. So there's this gigantic tennis racket in the middle of town. It's also famous for having the largest collection of horses and wagons taking grain to the railhead, which is 1936. I think there are apparently 600 horses in this old photograph they've got. But that's from, many, many farms and many, many teams. But anyway, the town in 2008 decided to have a Back to Barellan as a centenary celebration, and the locals enjoyed it so much that they wanted to continue that old-time Clydesdale type day that they had. And in 2011 or 12, they instigated the first of their good old days festivals, and it's grown ever since. And this year, 4 or 5 fellows basically spent most of the last year thinking about it and discussing it and deciding to put together a team of 62 horses and set a new Australian record and also a world record. And the world aspect still has to be confirmed through Guinness, but the record that they set was the largest team of horses pulling a laden wool wagon or a laden tabletop wagon.
15 spans of
15.
4 abreast plus 2 in the shafts. What does that mean?
That's right. Those old wool wagons or tabletop wagons have, they're a much heavier vehicle, so you can't just have a pole coming out the front with a horse on either side like you have on a Cobb and Co coach. You have a pair of shafts, which is like a heavy piece of wood on either side of each horse. So the two horses back at the back are in shafts, which gives them the ability to lean against the shafts as brakes, but also twice as many pieces of wood to lean against to steer. And then in front of them, you had a span of 4 horses, and in front of them another span of 4, and in front of them another span of 4. And so you end up having 15 spans of 4 horses, equals 60, plus 2 in the shafts. Altogether, the team was 75, 76 metres long. So the leaders are a long way from the drivers.
And they haven't got reins, those ones from the front, have they?
They do have reins.
Oh, they do?
Although Alex Berzins, who owns them, can drive them without reins. And he's done a few little demos at times where he's ploughed with a pair of horses and not used reins. In the old days, they often didn't use reins either. They had a good couple of leaders that they called call leaders, and the horses could be driven by voice command only. And the leaders were the key to the whole team, because if you steered them, the rest would hopefully follow in the right direction. But they didn't have reins on every single span. They had reins on the leaders, a set of reins roughly in the middle of the body, a set of reins back on, they call them the pin horses, which are the 4 in front of the shafts, and then a set of reins on the shaft pair, just to be able to fine-tune the back end as you're going through gates and things like that.
So who was actually driving this 62-horse team? Was there only one person, or there's more than that?
They could have given all the reins to one person if they needed to, but Alex Berzins is a Australian draft horse breeder from, it's just south of Sydney there. I've forgotten the name of the place. They call it Southern Highlands, I think. He drove the leaders and a fair few of the front half of the team. And then the bulk of the body of the team belonged to Steve and Jan Johnson from Lake Cargellico. Steve's a wonderful horseman, and they do all sorts of horse-drawn farming demos and things like that, and help out at shows just like Alex does. Steve had planned to sell quite a few of his horses, and he was telling me that Alex rang him up and said, hang on a minute, no, don't sell them, we're going to need them. And they slowly started adding up how many they needed and who they were going to get them from. I'm not sure quite where they got all of them from, but a local to Burrell, Alison Prentice, she had 3. They used hers. A woman called Heather McFarlane had a few, and they were put in. And a fellow called Bruce Bandy, who's the president of the Burrell Association, he had 6 or 8 or more that were used at the back. So each person basically drove their own horses, and the team was a composite one made up of several belonging to lots of people.
And they were all being on the carriage, were they?
They were all in front of the wagon pulling it.
Yeah, right. Now, Ian, sadly, we have run out of time, because I would have liked to have heard about your time coming out here from Africa and why your parents came and why you're at BBC and why do you seem like a man who's born into the wrong era. You should have been born perhaps, 100 years ago, do you think?
The comforts and conveniences of mobile phones and internet. I don't know that I'd want to give them up in a hurry.
That's right. And your YouTube channel, you're very prolific on your YouTube channel. Do
Thank
you
you.
have any time in your busy life to think about the Royals? Or do you have a favourite Royal?
Brisbane Royal's not bad. We go to the Ekka quite a bit with our horses.
I love it.
Is that the answer you were after, or you were after?
There's no specific answer. That's an answer befitting Ian. Stewart Koster. No, that's lovely. Lovely to hear. I like it. And are you a dancing man? I know that you've got very talented daughters who are beautiful singers, but has that come from a family of musical people?
That's 2 different questions there. Back when I was single, I used to do a bit of ballroom dancing and I enjoyed it, but these days my knees won't hold out. I'm not a dancing man anymore. But my wife, lovely wife Joan, was a music teacher, and as well as a nurse. And our 2 youngest girls, Helen and Sarah, learnt singing and piano from Joan. And because we used to be involved at John Deere and Woolshed, there was always a volunteers concert at the end of the Heritage Festival. And Helen, our middle daughter, went up to the organiser of the concert there when she was about 7 years old and asked if she could sing. And she sang Any Dream Will Do, and you could have heard a pin drop. It was just unbelievable. Anyway, somebody said, you better take her to this competition in Oakey because there's a country music competition and she'd be good. So a couple of weeks later we entered in that, and she won a novice category. Things went from there. She was down in Brisbane a little while later at the championships, and she got up in front of 300 people and she sang I Am Australian. I said to her afterwards, she was about 8 years old, what do you think when you're up on stage and you've got 300, 350 in the audience? And she said, I just pretend that they're ducks floating on a pond. And I thought, I can learn something from our kids. ever since that revelation hit me, I've learnt to play dumb. The dumber I play, the better our kids get.
I don't think you'd be playing dumb. I did hear Sarah and Helen singing Little Talks, which I thought I could somehow co-opt to be the backdrop for Big Little Small Talk or something. But it was hauntingly beautiful. So that talent, yeah.
About 10 years ago, I think, on a school assembly.
Yes. So if you were back in your ballroom dancing days, what was the song that you used to love to dance to?
I'm going to dodge that by saying that my knees wouldn't handle it, but your question was about songs. There was a line in Cat Stevens' Father and Son. If they were right, I'd agree, but it's them they know, not me. And as a kid, I used to find that identified with that more than anything else, because I was, keen on painting, I was keen on scrolls, I was keen on wagon wheels, and the rest of the world wasn't. And I was determined, no matter which way the rest of the world was trying to sway and steer me, that I still had this little narrow avenue of interest that I wanted to pursue. And I'm still chasing that little narrow avenue.
I think I would encourage all the listeners to go. I watched you paint a stripe. I think it was a Cobb and Co. It was a yellow, and you were painting a beautiful black stripe on it. Was, they talk about ASMR, that watching things like that. It was just absolutely mesmerising. I loved seeing you do it. You wouldn't have had a few too many rums the night before, I wouldn't imagine.
No, that's one of the second most common things people say when they watch me. I don't mind going out in public and giving demonstrations of lining and striping. Yeah, you wouldn't want to be on the turf the night before is what they say, or, gee, you've got a steady hand. And you get used to it. I'm happy to keep showing people because it's something that I didn't have a chance to learn from. I had to sort of learn the hard way by struggling and until I met up with Alec Hamilton. And actually, I didn't finish saying too, after I met Alec in 1986, every month I would go down and spend a day with him for the next 6 years until he passed away. And he wasn't able to paint anymore. He was too shaky, but he would just chat about the old coach builders in Brisbane and some of their workers and styles of paintwork on the different horse-drawn vehicles and things like that. And I'd take him photos of whatever I'd done, and he loved that. But he was a great old character, and I put together a YouTube clip all about Alec Hamilton. I just felt that he needed it.
No, it is beautiful, and watching him paint the side of that Mini or whatever it was that he was painting that's a lovely legacy that you've left for him and his family. But Ian, what you have done for Toowoomba too and for the legacy of Cobb and Co is incredible. Thank you for telling the story today on Big Little Small Talk.
Thank you, Megan. It's been a privilege and an honour to have you decide that you wanted to interview me. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Thank you. Goodbye.
That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me on Big Little Small Talk. I hope you can make the time to join me next week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app.
You've been listening to a 102.7 FM Toowoomba original podcast. For more podcasts or to listen to live and local Toowoomba radio, please visit 1027.com.au or listen on iHeartRadio and Community Radio Plus apps.